Just to check in, I see some new faces. We're doing a horizontal pedagogy workshop from 10 to 3 today. We're asking questions about the politics of the ways we teach, what we teach, and this is a facet of the Occupy University, which is an institution that's launching some new classes today. Actually, over there, we're launching Occupy Algebra. We've got some other classes on poetry and political feeling, on comic books and drawing. We've got other classes on radical economics, popular economics. And right now, I feel like we're struggling with this question. Something we talk about a lot is, what do you do with inequality of knowledge when you want to assume that there's an equality of intelligence? When you have to grade, when you have to give a grade, when you have to evaluate, and I guess when we say grade, we mean any kind of evaluation, whether it's a good job, or it's an A+, or if it's you're grading a test on a curve. What are we supposed to do in light of Occupy Wall Street with grading? It sounds to me like.
I would say too that the status of knowledge has become so bound up with its capacity to be some kind of capitalism. Like, knowledge is only valuable if it is in some way, my politics anyway, directly aligned with their intent to receive a job and find right away.
Something they accumulate when they spend in that.
Right. And so, how are you thinking of how do we imagine ourselves out of this unified understanding?
That sort of sounds like unlearning. It actually was really weird that you said unlearning, just because in the very beginning of our conversations about horizontal pedagogy back in December, unlearning was a huge concept for us. Really important. What it means to unlearn.
Could you give a quick recap of what you mean by unlearning?
What I mean?
Yeah, what you took away from it.
Oh, during those discussions.
You've been around for the discussions. So.
What did I take away from unlearning? I wish there's a group of us that's been meeting. So horizontal pedagogy is actually a class in the Occupy University that meets every Thursday at 8 p.m. at Union Square, where we talk about stuff like this. We do all kinds of different things. We recently did a Skillshare for notebook making, where the person who knew how to make notebooks didn't say anything. I wish my friend Jason was here. He loves this idea of unlearning. For him, anyway, it's about reproduction. Production and reproduction of knowledge, production and reproduction of forms of power, of habits, of what we take to be normal. And in a classroom setting, the pedagogy, is to say how you teach, is very wrapped up in the things that are being reproduced. So unlearning for us was, and I think continues to be, a kind of somehow a pedagogy of stopping or questioning or reflecting on reproduction, what's being reproduced. And as soon as we start to question what's being reproduced, we can evaluate whether or not we want to go ahead with it. It's not that we want to get rid of all of the history of traditional teaching methods. It's not that we want to ignore that we have a power dynamic. I don't know. Yeah, you mentioned we don't want to ignore it. The power is always there, right? But what we want to do is we kind of want to just figure out where it is, how it is, and see how we can work with it. Unlearning for us, I think, was very much a lot about that. And I think it's a process both for the teacher and the student. The teacher has to unlearn, in some ways, these normal things, because we all teach, if you teach, the way that we've learned. I find that as a teacher. But it's also a process for the students, because as soon as you refuse to be the master, I find being a little radical and studying some philosophy as a teacher, I feel like students are constantly saying, enslave me, in a way. I know that's hyperbolic, but for them it's a process of kind of unlearning. But that unlearning for them is almost like coming to trust themselves, right? So unlearning has a lot to do with trust also.
Just going on that a little bit too, I think a big part of that is changing our roles as teachers into letting our students see that we're constantly learning as well, and not just through being an adult, but also through engaging with them, and that they're teaching us things. Just like
leveling the field of power.
Exactly, leveling the field of power, and it's really frustrating because it doesn't matter being in the classroom and establishing that kind of rapport with your students. They move on the next year, and it's like it can go, you know, 1 step forward and 3 steps back, because there's still a lot of the very traditionally like set teachers who just refuse to even let their students know that they make mistakes. It's like, well, whether I made a mistake or not, I'm the teacher, so that's what I say.
But moving forward, even if they have that 1 good year, they're going to evaluate their future teachers and future learning against what worked with them in your room, and that's really empowering. And like they'll start to learn how to demand that level. So I used to get stuck in that thinking too, but I really quickly got out now because I'm like, this stuff doesn't go away. Like if it's quality, it's going to stick. And when they get to college or wherever they go, they're not going to waste their time being self-defeatist and feeling like it's their problem. They're like a little more empowered.
Because I mean, it seems like it taps into what's deeper in not only students and people in general. This unlearning idea, you know, is this like trusting our perceptions and shit, I totally forgot what I was going to say. So
It sounded really good.
yeah.
I guess I want to make comments about like being productive and being efficient in teaching and learning is something of difference. And we're talking about productivity and quantitative analysis of and evaluating education. I think horizontal strategy as a way of teaching and learning might not be the most effective way, or it might not be the most productive way in a sense they will generate grades or, you know, teach them very specific things. But it's also like a way of cooperative learning, and to do that you really need to trust each other. I say it's not productive because I run this thing called a public school in New York, which is one of the many free schools in New York that lets people propose a class, and we find teachers and a space to facilitate the class. So it's not accredited, it's not, we don't charge anyone. So we can't really do a full like quantum physics class, but we can do experiments in magic or fiction writing or how to fix your electricity. So it's more of a way of learning, a way of living as learning and teaching. But if you're like trying to get people ready for like a driving courses, I think you really need to be specific about instructions and then give them a certain guideline. So yeah, I guess my feeling is that horizontal pedagogy is 2 different things. More of a structure and more of a specific tactics for a specific class. Like, for example, this is horizontal, which works really well for our purpose right now. But if you were to generate a symposium or a TV series about this topic, it just wouldn't work this way.
I guess I agree and I disagree. I mean, I think it's true that like the exact same horizontal method would be sort of nonsensical to try and apply to every situation the same. But I also think there's this strange thing we do when we look at like education as it is, sort of like set up with a master and a bunch of slaves. Like we tend to see the kids that do really well more than the ones that like sort of don't say anything about how they're failing, like really awfully. And I think like it's easy to see like, oh, it doesn't take very much time to teach those kids who end up like being really smart. And like we can use that to think that like that method is just inherently faster or more productive, but I don't really think that that's necessarily true. I think ideally horizontal pedagogy has the potential to like educate a higher percentage of the people, which might lend itself to actually more productivity, even if it's slower for the smarter or faster kids or whatever, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this might be an appropriate time to say it. We talked about this a little bit before. In the context of Occupy University, and by the way, it's nice to meet you. We admire the public school very much, actually. In the context of Occupy University, which is this attempt to make another institution, the Horizontal Pedagogy Workshop, we've been committed to a particular kind of procedure of learning that we call horizontal, and we haven't really come to understand fully yet. as being responsible or irresponsible in all cases or not. But what we try to encourage and what we want to become for the university is a place where people can come, discuss, but reflect generally about how to teach and the ways of teaching. And whether or not, and this is something that's very important to me, if you're a teacher, you know that the people who are in front of you, from moment to moment, even if it's the same people, are radically different. They're feeling all kinds of things. They come from all kinds of places. They're dealing with something. They just came in and got in a fight at lunch or something. Like, they're coming in with a really overwhelming variety of experiences. At different moments, at different days, at different times for different people. Different pedagogies, that is to say, ways of teaching are going to be more appropriate, more effective than others. And what happens is when we just assume that one way, whether it's horizontal or vertical, when we just assume one way, we tend to miss out on the best way to educate the people who are in front of us. And so sometimes a lecture could be good, sometimes a Socratic discussion could be good, sometimes it might be nice to have a master if that's what people want. But if that's not what people want, we want to just create a space where we can kind of reflect on these things, because a lot of reproduction happens when we do it.
At Occupy University, we start every session basically with a check-in, and I think it's pretty accurate to say that every single session is vastly different in its procedures and its feel and its rhythm and whatever we got out of it. So, I mean, sort of like basing it from the students, like being student-centric as opposed to like tech-centric, or theme-centric or whatever really has helped to be very flexible.
I think that's so much all about your philosophy, and I think like all of these things, like the things you're talking about, really comes to the core of your philosophy. We can talk about horizontal pedagogy, we can talk about different forms and styles of teaching, but the core, like, is your philosophy that every single student can learn, wants to be part of this community, wants to better themselves, learn something, and I think that carries over into the classroom climate, and depending on how students will feel. We talked about like sending them off on the year, but I think the most important thing is giving students agency in their education.
What does it mean to
Give a real timing answer if you want.
Go for it.
If you want to use a like,
answer.
if you want a real Emile Durkheim's a sociologist, functionalist, or whatever people want to call him. I don't agree with that, but he says the process by which older, maybe quantitatively, but just more experienced members of a community impart upon less experienced members of the community the skills which they will need to survive and exist in that community, right? So it's a much broader concept than school learning. Schooling is not education. Education happens in a lot of other circles well outside of the school walls. Indeed, most of what we learn that we actually retain takes place outside of the school walls, which may have a lot to do with the way we teach in schools. But that's a general definition that I would offer. It's the best one I've heard.
But if, like, I guess a baby starts out knowing empathy and knowing all of these skills without them being corrupted by capitalism and all these different structures that we have in society, and there's this we talked about unlearning and how important that is, then what is positive education if it's taking us away from things like, I guess, or skills?
I've always loved, if you look at the etymology of the word education, it comes from the Latin. I think I don't know how to pronounce it, ectere, but it means to draw out. And so it has to do with drawing out a person's inherent capabilities.
Also, I think particularly a lot of what we've been talking about is not necessarily positive versus negative modes or right versus wrong modes, but simply shaking things up a bit and sort of opening it up and finding processes that allow you to have a continual like sort of mulling over and always new, always being open.
I have a question. Sort of related to this. It's about, I teach philosophy, and one of the classes I teach is a critical thinking class, and I think that, our job as educators is to teach critical thinking skills. It's one of the skills to impart in our community. But as a sort of liberal-minded person, I think it's always hard to draw the line between teaching critical thinking skills. I mean, I don't see my job as one of political or otherwise indoctrinating my students. It's not one of indoctrination. But at the same time, I have an agenda in my politics, not necessarily in my teaching, but in my politics. And I think that students, if I'm teaching a course on feminism, I want them to think a certain way about the world. If I'm teaching a course on that has to do with political philosophy, I want them to think a certain way about the world. I struggle sometimes with thinking about how to teach them certain skills and letting them come to their own conclusions, because it's always going to be worth more when they come to their own conclusions. And when those conclusions just seem totally to disagree with mine, or not to follow the logic. So I'm wondering if other people have this trouble, if your teachers, this sort of, I don't know, these two desires, to teach your students to think for themselves and to teach them to think like you.
What is the problem in this argument?
I was going to say I had some class today, but I didn't tell them where I was going. I'm unduly influenced by students because of that power.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, how do you call your students into thought?
What do you mean by that?
I don't know, I think it'd be open for anyone. I mean, I think maybe we can talk about not necessarily getting students to think another way or a specific way, but maybe talking about like, well, how do we invite them into thinking? I think that might be another way to approach the issue.
Isn't it precisely that, inviting someone to show them another perspective is precisely how you get critical thinking to happen?
Right.
So teaching them to think like you will engender in some students thinking like you, but it will engender in other students opposition to you. But that either one is fine. You must accept both results, I'm sure. But you can't teach critical thinking in a content neutral way. It's absolutely impossible.
Right, exactly.
There's no way to teach critical thinking without actual things being in front of them, right? That it would be silly to think that we could teach critical thinking without any concept.
Right.
But isn't everything political? I mean, do we have to come into the classroom with a claim of I'm not trying to, everything is political. Everyone has thought and idea and a passion, and that comes through in the way that we speak and the way that we dress and everything. And that gets transferred to our students no matter what. And I think acknowledging that and just having an open dialogue about things and acknowledging that, this is how I feel and this is how I believe, and that comes through in this way, and that will happen with you as well. And I'm not trying to be impartial or unbiased. And I am trying to get you to think, and this is maybe one of the ways I'm calling you to action, is to start challenging those things and thinking about those things. I don't know.
I think the danger is, though, that you might set yourself up in such a way that students feel like they can't disagree with you, right? If you are too strong about your own beliefs, then students think that, oh, well, if I disagree with her, she'll give me the A or whatever.
I think it works best when you create a situation where they can take
Right.
some of the way they're thinking or having their views.
Yeah, I always end up telling my students, I teach last semester I taught an intro course, and several times throughout the semester, students will ask me, well, what do you think about this, right? I'll give them a determinism view and a free will view, and they say, well, what do you think? And I'm like, well, my job's not to tell you what I think. My job is for you to figure out what you think and to talk to each other. But at the same time, especially when it comes to things maybe less abstract, and really important about women's rights or workers' rights, it seems almost irresponsible to say just figure out what you think.
So, I guess a shout out to the sun because it came out.
Yeah, for the second.
I think
So one thing is, sorry, I'm speechless. The idea of community and trust came up earlier, right? And so if we completely depoliticize ourselves and make ourselves completely neutral, then what community are we actually educating within? I don't know if part of our kind of rough education definition was to develop a community, to develop trust, then you have to be situated in that space mentally, politically, and emotionally to be within that learning community. So we have our learning community, this learning community right here, right now, which is within a larger learning community that is the city of New York, and we can just scale it out, right? But we're all situated in, and I can't remove my situated knowledge from that space, and so you can't neutralize yourself as a teacher. I don't think that that's even possible, because then you disassociate from the community and trust. And if my students can't trust me, they're not even gonna listen.
But do you think a way of gaining that trust is to be forthcoming about that?
Yeah, I think my opinion is you need to be very forthcoming of your positionality with your students in order to develop a trust relationship.
And then in turn accept that from them as well.
Accept their positionality and their situatedness is true too, right? So
and talk about that and acknowledge it.
Yeah, that's my approach.
Do you find that they are more cautious then about stating their own beliefs if they happen to come in conflict with yours?
Well, they haven't verbalized it, so there might be some that haven't verbalized that to me directly, so I can't say no that I haven't experienced that, but it might be there, but they're not necessarily, so I don't want to.
Well, those kids probably wouldn't be anyway.
I don't know.
Also, I might add to that, to this point, that I think that there's an important thing there's an important thing that's often overlooked, which is that claims to being apolitical are very political claims. And if we try to neutralize and claim to be apolitical and free from any sort of bias when looking at content, that assumes and enacts a particular position that we're very much conditioned to think we maybe should enact in the classroom, that we should make those claims to being apolitical, but we should also, I think, probably critically assess the extent to which that institutionalizes certain politics and ideologies.
I think there might be a difference though between claiming to be apolitical and just claiming to not disclose your political.
I don't think it's a matter of being apolitical. I think it's a matter of being kind of skeptical of the role of the teacher in the classroom, being hesitant to exert some of that power. Like when I was talking about not saying where I was going today, it's not relevant to the class. It's very egotistical. People talk about it. You know, we're not having class. Like they can make their own decisions whether they want to come here or not.
You didn't tell them where you were going?
Some of the things they asked me, but I didn't announce it. I'm not having class. I'm on strike. You know, of course I'm video games.
So I guess it's a question for those people who feel like being forthcoming about a kind of positionality is good in terms of generating an environment of trust. I guess I would complicate that by saying that education, no matter what the pedagogy doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? So there's this context in which it happens, whereby positions are voiced and evaluated outside of the classroom. And so to be forthcoming about your position may in fact sound like a de facto evaluation of another position. So I wonder how you guys what are your thoughts on that? Because regardless of what the classroom environment is like, it may be entirely different from what like a larger political environment is like. And if pundit A is saying something and voicing one opinion, pundit B is saying another thing, to totally contradict that, he gets nasty and kind of degenerates into this, I don't know, personal attack. And then I feel like those discussions those things get kind of embedded in that discussion, in that framework. To carry that into the classroom, you kind of have to be conscious of that context, regardless of, I guess I wonder what your guys' thoughts are.
I've been thinking recently that, like you mentioned pundits, and I think we're brought up to think that disagreement means attacking people and trying to win, as if there's like a winner and a loser. And I think probably a really beneficial thing for teachers to do is to encourage disagreement and challenging as like a building process, whereby none of us has the complete answer, but by challenging one another, which is why I would say better to put everything on the table and say, challenge me, let's like have a dialectical like thing going on. That's what I think. I think disagreement is really constructive.
My social studies professor just last week actually did this activity that I absolutely loved, and we were talking about vaccinations for young students, and rather than even share his stance beforehand, he came into the next class last week with for and against stances on it, and just split us up into smaller groups and handed each side one and said, you know, you're arguing this, read it, discuss it, and then you're going to debate. And we did that, and then he didn't even let us discuss it. He took the papers, swapped them, and said, now you're on the other side. And so we had to do the same thing again after having heard like what their stance was from the other side, not even really having a chance to like fully formulate our own opinions based on what we just heard from the other side. And I thought it was a really, really, really awesome activity and way to really have to step into the other side, and then we had to argue the other side also. So it was, I thought it was really cool.
And that seems to be a more, maybe a more fruitful way than like you as a professor going in, stating your stance, and then telling your students to argue with you, because you're in a position of power in the classroom, whether you want to be or not. But it's just the structure of it. So it seems to be more fruitful if you sort of, I mean, you don't have to claim to be apolitical, but you can at least say, I'm the moderator here, and you guys figure it out.
My question to you, actually, after what Jason brought up earlier, he asked how do you call students into thinking?
Right.
And after all this talk, particularly about being apolitical, being the moderator, whether we share our positions or not, I was wondering if I could ask you almost what you do almost as a teacher, because we talk a lot about pedagogy, and pedagogy for me is very specific. You know, you walk into the room, you put something on the board, you say hello class, or you introduce a question, or for instance you ask that question and then you make direct eye contact with the person, and when they're done talking, you say, good, does anyone else want to say anything? And then make eye contact with the next person and then say, that's interesting, does anyone want, you know, I'm wondering, I guess my question to you is how to really position yourself as the moderator. Because if you get yourself into a situation where you're trying to make yourself the moderator, I'm the moderator, I'm the moderator, there are a lot of these things called performative contradictions in the classroom, which I find really funny. Like I have students who ask me, can I speak now? And stuff like that. So when the teacher says, I'm the moderator, I want you to think, a lot of times it's actually, you're performing this sort of contradiction.
But do you think that's what most teachers say? I'm the moderator, I want you to think? Do you think good teachers, they don't say it that way? The good teacher interchanges with whomever their students are. Somebody has to start the conversation. A teacher, by the fact that a teacher has a certain kind of knowledge, and I think of a teacher, there are alternative schools where the teacher sits in a circle with kids or people of the same age, and you make it a circle. So then it's not up, down. I think that's part of it that you're talking about, this pedagogy where somebody's higher, and I think what you're trying to say is how do we create an even playing field, even though a person has the authority with the most, you know, for education, whatever. I think a circle is a good way to do it. Anyway, I just wanted to make a comment on your excellent comments.
Yeah, and I think too, you have to think about your role. I always think about my classroom in sort of two stages, right? The first one is like, do we understand the reading? Usually like trying to pull apart the text, like, do we understand this person's argument? Have we read it with some sort of critical, comprehensive reading? And then the second half is like, do you agree with this person? Right? And the first half, I think the teacher plays a stronger role. The second half, I let the students follow each other. Whoever speaks calls on the next person.